reporters are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Well, hello there and welcome to Nowhere to Hide. Glad you could join me today, and I've got a great bit of information to share with you about how the devil is in the details, especially when it comes to how the news media reports even the most mundane facts to us. Now, this is not some wild-eyed, they're telling us the big lies and they're going to just boldly, tell us that black is white or the sun isn't shining when it's noontime. It's a lot more subtle than that. But it's also some very good insight into the little things that undermine the public's trust in mainstream media. And by the way, just so you understand, Gallup has conducted yet another poll for 3 years running. Trust in the media remains at an all-time low. 3 years, meaning people don't trust mainstream media to tell them enough about what's going on to be able to really count on that information. Now, some people, of course, are dependent upon it. There are those. You can tell, actually, the things that make a person upset will tell you a lot about where they get their information. But the things that mislead people, again, usually it's not a big, audacious lie. Those things they're far too easy to discredit or to be pinpointed as outlandish. Sometimes it's a little more subtle. Let me give you an example of what that looks like. And this is courtesy of Betsy Russell and also Carolyn I'm going to have to struggle with your name a bit here, Carolyn. Komatsulis? Anyway, this is from Idaho Press. This was actually published in the Big Country News Connection just a few days ago. And it's 50 new lawmakers elected to Idaho legislature. Party numbers remain the same. This article is mostly boring numbers, a few names and numbers, and it's it's a recap. You would think that this is the kind of data that would be pretty hard to tart up with some bias. But Betsy and her friend find a way. I'll give you an example of what that looks like. It's a very simple matter of just keywords dropped in to help lead us in the direction of a conclusion of the choosing of the person writing the article. So when they talk about the big difference this time around after this election is a higher number of what they call ultra-conservatives in the Senate Republican caucus. Now, I don't know what has happened to the term conservative. I'm not that big on labels anyway. I just want to know, do you support limits on government? Do you support people's natural rights or not? But for those who play the label game, the people who believe in word magic, well, by putting a label out there, ultra-conservatives, we're supposed to make some kind of emotional connection as to what exactly that means. Are there conservatives anymore? You don't really see just a conservative person described as a conservative anymore. It's ultra-conservative, it's hard right, it's far right. Sometimes they just come right out and say extremist. But where is the information to give some context to this? This is what I mean. Subtle little words that end up trying to lead us someplace that maybe we wouldn't have arrived, again, if we were just making our own conclusions. This is just a nudge. It's not a shove, but a gentle nudge in the right direction. They talk about outspoken conservatives. I didn't highlight the word outspoken, but again, what constitutes an outspoken conservative? Really? I mean, is there some threshold of this many words and suddenly you're outspoken? Is it the decibel level of your voice? Give us some context. What do we mean? And of course, you don't need a lot of context for this when they talk about bombastic former Senator Dan Foreman of Moscow. Bombastic. Where is the context to tell us what we mean by bombastic? I mean, for some people, that's going to have a very negative connotation. I think for most people, we'd be like, oh, bombastic, what, like Rush Limbaugh? But there's no context here to explain what earns Dan Foreman that title. And I don't think we're supposed to question these sort of things, which is exactly why. Why drop a word in there like that if it's just to assume that everybody is supposed to know for themselves what that means, what we mean when we say bombastic. Here's another example. They talk about the wild card of a passage of a constitutional amendment allowing lawmakers to call themselves back into special session whenever they choose. This was SJR 102. What makes that a wild card? Now, they express the concern here in this particular snippet about, well, there's no limits on the length or frequency of those self-called special sessions, but let's keep in mind the reason that this particular option was on the ballot in the first place is because the legislature was powerless to counter some of the harm being done by the governor when he was acting as a unitary executive during the COVID crisis. In other words, he was acting as kind of all the branches of government at once, issuing executive orders which were then enforced as if they were law. But in truth, we have a lawmaking body, and that is the legislature. And they had to wait until the governor deigned to, well, okay, I'll call you guys into session, knowing full well that they would try to limit his power and some of the things that he was doing, which, look, I'm just going to be blunt. A lot of the things Governor Little supported were harmful. Lockdowns, the mandates, the things he pushed were harmful, and they were unnecessary. Now, at least with this deliberative body that we call the legislature, you have people who are accountable to the people of Idaho on a very regular basis. The governor is supposed to execute the laws, not make them. So I don't see why it's a wild card. I see it as a sadly necessary move to rein in executive power, which was clearly misused during this last crisis. Now, look at this. Here we are describing a Democrat, though. Okay, so this is talking about the Democrats who will be in the Senate. And, a centrist Democrat, or centrist Democrat just, in District 15. Well, I mean, could anybody find offense in someone who's a centrist? No outspoken, no bombastic, nothing at all, nothing, no adjective that could possibly lead us to think anything negative. And again, I don't think they should be using labels either way. I'm not saying that, if you're going to be negative about the Republicans, you ought to be negative about the Democrats. It's just kind of a gentle nudge. Oh, but this centrist Democrat here is just one in Treasure Valley's District 15. And kind of an interesting choice of words. And again, it betrays this bias that Betsy I know she gets very riled when people call her out on not being a professional journalist. And she'll remind you, well, my fellow journalists say that I'm not biased, and why I have awards. I've won awards from them that prove this. And I even asked other people who like me, and they say that I'm not biased too. The problem is looking you back in the face in the mirror. And it's something you don't want to see, Betsy. And I understand that. But again, it's little weasel words to try to steer us in the right direction. Again, later in the article, it refers to, again, bombastic former GOP Senator Dan Foreman. What makes him bombastic? The fact that you disagree with him? Does that mean that the rest of us are supposed to come to that same conclusion? And one last one here. They talk about 15 new faces in the Idaho Senate, including some very outspoken conservatives. Well, is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? Frankly, if these are people who are standing up for my natural rights, I would say that's actually good. I want people who aren't easily bullied or led by the nose. The problem with this, and I guess the place where I take issue is assumes that the news story is somehow like a child. And we need to be very carefully led so that we don't stumble into something that we're not supposed to. You don't step in that puddle of truth. And we don't need Mama Betsy leading us along by the hand to tell us where we should go and where we shouldn't. We are thinking adults, and we should be able to make these kinds of decisions and these kinds of assessments for ourselves. I know a lot of people are kind of new to this. They don't trust themselves. I mean, I want people out there who have their finger on the pulse of what's happening. That's understandable. But there is no such thing as an unbiased journalist. The only thing you're going to find are journalists who are honest and transparent about their biases, and that's what you need to find. And sadly, Betsy ain't one of them. Oh, and one last shot here. Controversial former Representative Phil Hart. Again, no context as to what it is that makes him controversial. Just the assurance that someone in the news thinks he's controversial, and therefore you should probably come to that same conclusion. It doesn't seem to me that this is operating in the interest of the public. And my goal here is not to, set you up to spend the weekend now seething over, our media is really unfair, and they use these little nudges to try to steer us in a direction of their choosing. What I'm trying to point out here is if you want to be an informed person, the burden is on you. So it's got to be something that matters enough to you that you're willing to shoulder the responsibility, you're willing to dig in and to do the hard work. But the thing you should keep in mind, the thing that should spark the interest in that journey is the recognition that we're still looking for that right phrase to describe a media that behaves like some kind of adversary to the populace, because that's exactly what they're doing. You and I have the power to think for ourselves, to judge things for ourselves, and to come to our own conclusions. I'm not telling you don't look at the mainstream media. I'm just saying whatever media you look at, understand that the burden of sorting it out and separating fact from fiction is really on you. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
well, that's not